Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, we've reached the final trial in our series, Politics on Trial, though I will be coming back later in the year to talk about some ongoing legal proceedings around the world. There is a lot going on. Today, I'm talking to the historian and political scientist Glen Rangwala, who was very involved in interrogating, in fact, in dismantling the case that the British government made for the Iraq War in 2003. And we are going to be talking about the trial that followed that war, the trial of Saddam Hussein. Glen, I think we're going to need to start with some background and context. And I realise this is a difficult question to answer because it's about going back to the mindset of the people who were prosecuting this war in advance. But do you have any idea of what particularly the Bush administration thought was going to happen to Saddam after this war? If they were assuming, and I think they must have been, that they were going to be victorious, did they have a plan for him? Did they envisage him dead? Did they envisage him captured on trial? Do we know?
I think they did leave open the possibility that they would capture him alive. So going back a few years, there'd been a long-standing idea that there needed to be trials for the regime members if and when they were captured. So if not Saddam, then the other members of the government as well would be, some of them at least would be caught. And so in the Iraq Liberation Act of 1998, the US Congress specifically authorized the US government to seek to set up a tribunal for any regime members that would be captured in the event of the regime falling. That's, of course, well before this happens, but at that point, there is already this idea that at some point, this enemy government will fall and that we need to have a procedure in place for that to happen. And this is then the idea that's taken up by many of the supporters of regime change within the Bush administration. A number of them do speak about the extent to which they want to not just overthrow the government, but then bring justice, in their sense, for the victims of that government. This becomes particularly important for a large number of Iraqi exiles, especially those who have aligned with the US government from the 1990s, in seeking to find ways to bring their grievances to bear against that government for what they have done. And so there is a very active transitional justice working group that's been established, which produces this sort of mountain of information about the crimes of the Ba'ath government in Iraq, that digitizes all this information, loads it onto a series of disks, and gives it to the US government. So there is a very significant sort of infrastructure that's already been built around the idea that someday these people will be captured, these people will no longer be in power, and that they can be prosecuted.
The question, though, when we talk about a tribunal, there are a lot of different ways that might be understood. And also there is a question about what specifically the regime, and Saddam in particular, might be charged with. So I'm going to go back to the rationale for the war. And I want to talk about this anyway to get a sense. It's a long time ago, but it still seems quite live in some respects. And there are contemporary analogies with some of the things I'm going to talk about here. Putting it crudely, there were three kinds of rationale for this war. And each of them might result in a different understanding of what justice, if Saddam was going to be charged with crimes, would look like. So one of them, this was one that probably faded away quickest and was hardest to sustain. But nonetheless, it was certainly there in the saber rattling before the war. This had something to do with 9/11, or if not with 9/11, at least with global terrorism. Saddam was a threat partly because of things that had happened on United States soil. And that at least raised the possibility of charges being brought against Saddam in the United States. So one of the questions might be whether any legal proceedings would take place in the United States. Then there was the question of breaches of international law and the whole set of events in the United Nations trying to establish a legal basis for this war in international law. Breaches of international law raise the possibility that legal proceedings should happen in an international tribunal. It could be an international criminal court. But nonetheless, and there were, of course, precedents for that as well. Third, this was about regime change. But it was about regime change. And again, this could go in two different ways. Regime change because what's wrong with this regime are crimes against humanity, which again could result in an international legal proceedings, or specifically, as presumably these Iraqi exiles wanted, the crimes are very much crimes that happened within Iraq, a long history of atrocities, and justice needed to be served in Iraq. Now, those are three very different kinds of outcomes. Putting it crudely, he could have been tried in the United States, he could have been tried at The Hague, or he could have been tried in Iraq. It turns out he was tried in Iraq. How much of it do you think did depend on what people saw as the rationale for the war? So if you were a regime changer, you have one view. If you're a international law person, you have another view. If he's an international terrorist, you have a third view. Do you think it cashes out like that?
I do think so, and I think you're right to put it in that order. The first one, the idea of Saddam Hussein as being an international terrorist or supporting international terrorism, in that sense, I think relied upon a fairly marginal set of evidences. The confidence that they would have to be able to prosecute him in the United States court, I think, was relatively light. And so the Noriega example, what we now might think about as the Maduro example, where a leader is captured and charged with drug trafficking, there the evidence is much stronger, I think, than it was the case with Iraq and Saddam Hussein's government. There is a very limited basis on which I think there was confidence that that could be done and done well. And that's only, again, a relatively small number of people, so who could be found and prosecuted in that way. When I think more generally, by the time of March, April 2003, this becomes much more part of a process of regime change, and therefore the former members of the regime need to be held accountable in order to substantiate that conception that what is going on is a process of changing the regime. So I think that becomes part of the way in which the conception of what this is all about shapes the outcome for what happens to Saddam Hussein. I think clearly there is an idea that this could be done at some level internationally. That idea of international human rights, the international human rights regime, does lend itself towards the establishment of tribunals. But of course, that relies upon a set of actors that aren't just the United States, not just the US and Britain. It relies upon some form of international agreement through the United Nations, which by the point of March, April 2003 is just not there. So at that point, when the invasion happens, the expectation is that Russia, China, France even, will not allow through the United Nations the establishment of a mechanism, a tribunal form, that would enable the prosecution of Saddam Hussein. A further problem is that at that stage, at least, the examples of the use of international tribunals were problematic. So Saddam Hussein wasn't the only leader on trial in late 2003, early 2004. You have Milosevic as well, Slobodan Milosevic from former Yugoslavia, Serbia, on trial at the same time in The Hague. A set of 66 charges brought against him, a very long drawn-out trial which still hadn't finished by the time he died in 2006, so a trial that had been going on for 4 years, and was coming nowhere near to its conclusion even at that stage. And that clearly, I think, does not speak to the sort of case that the US wanted, which was a relatively quick trial, or set of trials, that would bring about the discrediting of the former government. There's also the sense that international tribunals would not be willing to use the death penalty. And I think that also figures in US thinking at this point that international tribunals would lead to imprisonment, life-term imprisonment. It wouldn't lead to execution. And I think that sense to which that should be an option on the table was very much there in US thinking when it came to thinking through what prosecution would entail.
I'm going to ask you a question that I realize is a hypothetical to which it might not be possible to give a clear answer. But had Saddam been captured at the end of Gulf War One, so in 1991, had the Americans gone in or had someone betrayed him and he'd been taken, do you think then it was more likely that there would have been some kind of assuming that he was put on trial, he might not have been, we don't know, but if he had been put on trial, that there would have been more international consensus and therefore allowing the possibility for him to be tried in an international court. It was also much earlier, as you say, in the process of these international tribunals of heads of state charged with all sorts of crimes, including crimes against humanity. We're in the post-Nuremberg regime, but still that late 20th, early 21st century version, as you say, which sort of ran into the sand. Do you think there would have been a different outcome if he'd been caught at the end of Gulf War One? Because what's interesting, as we're going to come on to, is that the crimes he was charged with in Iraq in the two trials had taken place before Gulf War One. So they weren't recent events. They were actually both from the 1980s, which in itself is fascinating. We're going to come on to that, how far back it went in order to find the crimes with which he was going to be charged. Do you have a sense of what might have happened if he had been taken first time round?
I think it's quite plausible he would have been charged with the crime of aggression. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, that is still seen as the ultimate international crime. Not crimes against humanity, but the crime of aggression was a much more prominent.
So the invasion itself.
Yes, so the invasion of Kuwait, yeah, would have been, I think, probably the primary basis on which any prosecution would have been launched. That said, I mean, even at that stage, the mechanisms internationally for that were untested. There'd been no significant international tribunal created since Tokyo and prior to that Nuremberg at the end of the Second World War. And so the opportunities to sort of put together a sense of what a trial might look like, I think would have been limited. But the most obvious case would have been the crime of aggression to use in that context. It could also be done under Iraqi law. I mean, there already was an Iraqi law from 1958 that made illegal the use of force against another Arab country. And so it could have been done under Iraqi law, not just international law, if, say, for example, in 1991, the regime had crumbled completely internally, which it wasn't that far away from doing, and the government had been overthrown with international help by internal actors. So that could have been a possibility then. I think that would have been far more likely to be the focus of any prosecution rather than the humanitarian situation or the human rights abuses by the Iraqi government at that point.
Just to come back to the Maduro example and Noriega, as you also mentioned. So Manuel Noriega, who was the Panamanian dictator, I think we should call him that, who was taken by the Americans at the end of the 1980s. And he was tried in Miami, I believe, a federal court in Miami, and sentenced to roughly 20 years in jail. We don't know how Maduro exactly is going to be charged. We don't know how the trial is going to play out. We assume there will be one. I mean, I'm assuming there will be a trial. There seem to be two big differences here, one of which is that in both cases, the policy was essentially a decapitation of the regime policy. This was about extracting the guy, the bad guy, the boss of the regime, Maduro Noriega, getting him into the United States. There was no equivalent, I assume, ever policy in the United States. I mean, I don't know whether the CIA ever drew up plans to simply extract Saddam. And then the second difference is in both the Maduro and the Noriega case, this is in America's backyard. So in order to construct a plausible legal case against them, it was a lot easier because drug trafficking, racketeering, all the rest of it, the interplay between Central and Southern America and the United States, it's much easier to find the links. Iraq is a long way away. And so it feels like they're two very, very different sets of examples of what might happen in a case like this when the United States finds itself in possession of the dictator of a regime.
I think that's right. I think there had just been the significant debate in late 2001 about Afghan prisoners of war as well, about not hosting them on US territory, concerned that they will abuse the US legal system in ways that will ensure that they go free. And that's why Guantanamo Bay, the detention camp there, is constructed to take them out of off US territory, where the claim is made that US laws don't apply. And so that was very much in mind in 2003 with the Iraqi captives from the 2003 war, the sense that you couldn't just bring them over to the US and expect them to be tried under any sort of US legal code. and that you actually needed to have some sort of extraterritorial prosecution if they're going to be prosecuted at all. The difference also with Venezuela today, Panama in 1989, was that there was a large US military presence on the ground also in Iraq. Unlike in Venezuela or Panama, there were 148,000 US troops there. There was very limited prospect of them being forced to undertake a disorderly exit from Iraq in 2003. So you could have the trial in Iraq. You could have the trial under Iraqi law. You could have Iraqis who were by and large supportive, I think, of the idea of there being a trial in Iraq, being involved actively in that process. Now, we'll come to discuss why it doesn't work out in the way that they think it will. But at the time, in late 2003, when Saddam Hussein is captured, that sense to which this actually could make a difference to the trajectory of the US occupation, a positive difference, is very much there in US thinking, I think.
So I want to ask you one more background question, and that relates to Britain. So you were closely involved at the time in analysing and indeed criticising some of the case that was made by the Tony Blair government for British involvement in the war and for the war itself. Of course, the Blair government was for a while very keen to take this through the United Nations. The Blair government, bits of the Blair government, were hypersensitive to the question of whether or not this could be justified under international law. Do we know, was there a difference of opinion between Britain and the United States, between the Blair and Bush administrations, about the possible legal outcome in relation to Saddam himself? Was there pressure from the British or indeed from other European allies? I believe there was some pressure from the Portuguese, for instance, that this did have to be an event which would ultimately, even if beforehand it was quite hard to get the international law case tight enough to hold, afterwards you could at least then come back to international law in order to reframe it as an event under international law. So this wasn't just a United States operation. Was there pressure from the few allies that the US had to make this an international law proceeding?
Yes, I think that's clearly true. So one of the key issues going on in the US in its international diplomacy after the invasion has happened has been to try to put some sort of legal basis together for the occupation of Iraq. And that culminates in the UN Security Council resolution, which essentially establishes a legal basis for how the occupation will run. That's Resolution 1483, which then enables other countries around the world to take a role in reintegrating Iraq into international affairs, both providing personnel, and by late 2003, about 20 different countries have provided troops for the US, and in establishing trading relationships with Iraq, which of course the US needs. It needs to have a functioning Iraq. And so the reintegration of Iraq into some sort of system internationally, I think, does provide a framework through which a legal code is set down, within which Iraq is presented as a law-abiding member of the international community, in which the actions taken by the US and its allies in Iraq are presented as being part of how that reintegration will occur. And so it's not just the UK. I think in that sense, the UK had almost committed itself to something in Iraq and had already made that decision. But it's the other countries who, by late 2003, are very much part of the US plan to try to create a more stable framework through which Iraq can be governed now that the old regime has been toppled.
So do you think that the British effectively had reconciled themselves to the fact that this was not an illegal war, but that it was a war that was not going to be capable of being framed within an international legal framework when it came to meting out justice to the leading figures in the regime? So I read somewhere that, what was the Portuguese leader called?
Jose Maria Aznar. Aznar does have a conversation with Bush about this very issue before the invasion has occurred, where Bush is trying to tell Aznar that he has ideas about how Saddam Hussein can be prosecuted if he's caught. And so that's the one case where I think there is a clear attempt to try to get another European country to participate actively in the occupation of Iraq before the invasion had actually occurred, in a way at that time the Spanish government had not committed itself. The British government had committed itself to that, whatever. Tony Blair famously had told Bush that he'd be stand with him whatever happens in Iraq. other European governments hadn't, other governments like around the world which do participate again, Thailand, Japan, they have sent troops by late 2003 to help the US. Those countries have not. And I think you can't disentangle the decision to create a legal framework for prosecution of the former regime from that attempt to try to recreate the idea that Iraq is a law-abiding society under US leadership.
So let's talk about the circumstances in Iraq. Remind people, remind me, of the condition of Iraq, first of all, at the point when Saddam was taken. I still remember the press conference in which the head of the American occupying forces got up and said, "We got him." What state was Iraq in December 2003? How stable, or should I say, how unstable was it?
So I just left the country at that point. So I'd been in Iraq in late 2003, but just left as it happens by that point. It was a highly disorderly setting. And that's on a number of different levels. On the political level, the coalition of Iraqi political groups that the US had originally seen as the people to whom power should be handed over to was increasingly fractious. And again, we'll come back to that, I'm sure, over the course of this conversation. But the sense of a stable group of politicians in Iraq who could take over the mechanisms of government by late 2003 was not seen as a credible strategy. The US had recently established a new scheme in which elections will be postponed for 2 years until late 2005 before there'll be any sort of national elections because of a sense of not being able to trust what would be the result of any competitive formal structure for creating a new Iraqi government. And so in that sense of political disorder, there is a sense to which the US's role will have to be a longer term role than was originally being projected. But going alongside that, there is a growing insurgency as well by late 2003. And there are significant acts which are largely targeting military forces within Iraq at this point. There's been bombings at the Italian compound in November. There'd been a significant bombing at the Bulgarian compound. And so these are often attacks that are targeting the supporters of the US, the allies of the US within Iraq. The most significant one, the one that got the most international attention, was the bombing of the UN compound, the United Nations compound in Baghdad. The two bombings of that compound led to the United Nations withdrawing its personnel from Iraq. The insurgency in that sense was targeting the institutions that stood between Iraqis and Americans in that sense, a sense of trying to turn this into a struggle that would pit those two groups against each other without it becoming a struggle in which the rest of the world would participate. And so in that context, at least, there is a fair degree to which there is a very limited sense to which the US has a major plan for what to do other than try to defeat the insurgency through military means. By November, the month before Saddam Hussein was captured, the US was starting to use aerial bombardment for the first time since the actual culmination of formal hostilities earlier that year with the invasion itself. The bases of rebel groups were being bombed from the air and by missile for the first time. So this is an escalating conflict. This is a conflict in which the US is seeing the need to really dig in and struggling with problems of political legitimacy in the context of not having an Iraqi partner that they can trust to hand power over to.
When you were there in Iraq just before the capture of Saddam, did you get a sense of what prevailing attitudes were to Saddam himself? He was still on the run. No one knew where he was. Was there a hunger to get him, to bring him to justice? Were there increasing signs that there were some people who would, in one form or another, be unhappy with that outcome?
Yeah, I think by far the vast majority of Iraqis were happy he was no longer in power. And that resulted in, I think, a sense to which, yes, some form of accountability would have been preferable. That said, it wasn't people's priorities. It wasn't the key issue at stake. It wasn't seen as being of crucial significance for Iraq's future that the former leadership would be put on trial. There is a sense to which Saddam's leadership was seen as having no prospect of returning, having no prospect of reforming itself, and therefore, in some sense, becoming a fixture of the past rather than of anything else. Of course, there were those who had direct claims on victimhood, especially those who'd lost close family members. And there, I think at least, the claim for needing some form of trial to establish the accountability of the former government was important. But rarely did it come up as being people's priorities in this period.
How much fear was there given the increasing instability? So not simply the insurgency, but the fact that the United States hope that a group of politicians would be able to take over the country and work together, and this was being undone, not least by sectarian divisions. How much fear was there that a trial of Saddam might inflame rather than dampen down those divisions? Was there an anxiety that actually this was likely to be quite a dangerous and provocative event precisely because it would not just throw fuel on the fire of those divisions, but remind people of so many of the crimes that lay behind the profound mistrust that existed between different communities in Iraq?
I think in some ways that was also part of the point. The idea in late 2003 from the United States was that the danger came from what it referred to as former regime elements. FREs, this became the term that they used frequently. FREs were the problem. They were the insurgents. They were the people who were the threat to Iraq's stability. And the trial of the former members of that regime would be, in that sense, the demonstration to Iraqis that they were defeated, that there was no point aligning with the FREs, there was no point giving support to them or pretending that they were part of Iraq's future. These were the people who'd committed these awful crimes. These were the people who should be exposed for what they did. And these are the people who will be then prosecuted, tried, imprisoned, or executed for doing what they did. That was the defeat of the former regime by bringing them to trial, by prosecuting them, by imprisoning or killing them. That was the marker of the end of the former regime. So in that sense, this was seen as being part of the process of bringing the insurgency to an end. However, the key problem there is that actually that isn't the main form of insurgency that did develop in Iraq over the coming years. And the people who actually ended up taking up the insurgency against the US were not those who spoke in the name of the former regime. They were those who made claim to Islamic ideals, who spoke in the name of an Islamic revolution in Iraq, both from within the Sunni and the Shia Muslim communities, who also presented themselves as having been victims of the Saddam government. So in that sense, they were just as aggrieved, just as insistent on the trial of the former regime as those who actually held those officials. They would just as much wanted vengeance upon those individuals, but that didn't stop them positioning themselves crucially against the US role in Iraq and supporting of the idea that they had, in some sense, a cause for insurgency against the US.
I now want to ask you how it was decided what to charge Saddam. And it wasn't just Saddam. So the two trials of Saddam, in each case, it was Saddam and a small number of members of the Ba'athist regime tried alongside him, a handful in each case. But the two trials of Saddam focused on two particular crimes or sets of crimes. There's a wide range that they could have chosen from here. I mean, I think we have to be clear. He was a very bad man and his regime did a lot of very bad things. But as you also said, for instance, he could have been, but he wasn't charged with the invasion of Kuwait. That was a crime under Iraqi law, as you said. The focus instead was on, in one case, a crime that was framed as a form of genocide, and in the other case, mass murder. The Anfal campaign against the Kurds from 1988, both of these events happening in the broad context of the Iran-Iraq war, and earlier than that, the Dujail massacre following an assassination attempt against Saddam in 1982. So we need to explain these events in themselves, but why those two in particular? What was their significance? And could there have been others? And if so, how wide was the menu from which these two were chosen?
There could have been a very large number of different crimes for which members of the government would have been prosecuted. The one you didn't mention, of course, was the invasion of Iran in 1980, which was probably the single most bloody of all of the decisions taken by the Ba'ath government, leading as it did to over 1 million deaths. So it is interesting that Dujail was chosen as the first of the different charges on which to prosecute members of the former government. So this is not widely known outside of Iraq, except by Iraqi exiles. it wasn't a case that had much attention internationally at the time in 1982 when it happened. But what had happened basically is that Saddam Hussein had been giving speeches around the country to show his support for recruits, conscripts during the Iran-Iraq War, and went to this town in the north of Baghdad, Dujail, to give a speech praising those who were enlisting with the Iraqi armed forces. It was a town that was notable because it was a Shia Muslim majority town. Alignment with one particular opposition party, the Dawa party, was high. It was often seen as the centre of al-Dawa's activities north of Baghdad. It was their main base in that region. And what I think Saddam wanted to do was show that even in towns where they don't like our government, they're still willing to sign up to support the war against Iran. He goes and gives this speech, goes to visit parents of young soldiers who are fighting in that war, very widely sort of publicised, that it's shown live on television at the time. But on his way out of the town in the motorcade, as he's leaving the town, there are a number of different gunmen who shoot at the motorcade. And this leads in reprisal to, well, firstly, a very large firefight on the day. A large number of people are killed at the time, but then mass arrests around the town afterwards. So you have 350 odd members of the community being arrested and held in a detention camp, interrogated, tortured. A significant number, 62, die in conditions of detention, showing something about the ways in which the detention conditions were appalling. Over the course of the next 3 years, members of this group who have been detained are put on trial, and executions take place for over 100 of those people. So you have a significant number of members of this community, including youngsters under 18s, being executed for alleged membership of a conspiracy to assassinate Saddam Hussein. And I think one thing that's very noticeable about this is how it becomes part of the Dawa party's story of itself. So you have this political party that comes to be largely based outside of the country after the war, after 1988, after 1990. Its membership is largely outside of Iraq, which uses Dujail as being its primary show of how it's been a persecuted institution within Iraq. This becomes part of its mythology in some ways, of how they've tried to overthrow the government, but how the government responded with intense brutality against its members, including those who were innocent of any part of the conspiracy to assassinate Saddam Hussein, but were used the most brutal measures against them. And you often saw the photos of the people who were killed in the reprisals and the executions as part of the Dawa party's sort of memorialization of its own self. So it has these sort of panorama photos of Dujail and his pictures of the people. And so from 1990 onwards, this is very much part of the Dawa party's account of how it has struggled against the Iraqi government and how it has stood up against it.
And how significant was that party? And indeed, did this evidence show up in that database that you described at the beginning? Was this part of the case that was being made to the Americans? This is why the regime has to be replaced?
So I think what's interesting about the organisation of the trial is that increasingly this becomes part of contentious Iraqi politics. Who gets to speak in the name of Iraq's victims? Who has primary claim on that victimhood becomes part of Iraqis' debates between themselves about what should be done in this trial. So the Kurdish parties are making the argument that the Halabja massacre of 1988, the Anfal campaign which you referred to, should be the key issue around which the regime is tried. The Dawa party, based in the Shia Muslim community, is making the case that Dujail should be the primary case. The Turkmen are arguing for the expulsion of Turkmen as being the primary basis around which the trial should occur. So what you have is this highly contentious, fractious situation where different political groupings within Iraq are making different claims on how to understand the primary crimes of the former regime. And you can't really understand the decision to prioritise Dujail in 2005. That's the first charge that's brought against Saddam Hussein and members of his government, outside of the way in which the Dawa party becomes the primary vehicle through which the Iraqi government comes to take on its role in relating to the past, but also its claim to how it is now an act of taking action against the members of the former government. So because that party is now central to the Iraqi government, it's now able to use that as a way to say, this is what we've brought to our supporters. This is what we've done for the people who've given their time, their work, their lives in supporting us, in prioritizing Dujail as being the primary story for Iraqi's victimhood. It's interesting that Dujail is also the first. So in the Iraqi constitution, the 2005 constitution, Dujail is specifically mentioned in the second paragraph of the preamble to the constitution as showing how the Iraqi people have recovered from the brutality of the past. Dujail is the first place mentioned in the constitution as demonstrating what the new government is overcoming the legacy of Iraq's past, in which this brutality of the former government is exemplified by what they did in Dujail.
You said earlier that the insurgency, which the Americans wanted to present as renegades from the old regime, was actually being driven by people from across Iraqi society, Sunni as well as Shia, who saw themselves as victims of the Saddam regime. So for those Sunni communities that felt they were victims of the regime, who did not get their day in court, so the two groups that were singled out were a specific instance, but more broadly, of Shia resentment at this regime, which has been bubbling away, to put it mildly, for a long, long time. And then we'll come on to the case of the Kurds. But were there therefore groups in Iraq at the time who were now part of the insurgency, who were rebelling against the regime that was trying to establish itself, who thought that this trial or these two trials excluded them? They were not being recognized as also being victims of the regime.
I think that's a plausible way to look at it. I think in some ways, by giving authority to certain groups to say, we were the victims, we were the primary victims of the former government, we should have accountability for the atrocities committed against our communities, you are necessarily engaged in a process of saying some crimes matter more than others, that some cases of victimhood are more pronounced than those of other victims. And the very decision to prioritise Dujail, I think in that sense, does say something that's more about who holds effective power within Iraq in 2005, when that decision is taken to go for that, rather than something about the necessary gravity of the offences committed by the former regime in the 1980s. So the decision to prioritise Dujail over Halabja, you mentioned Halabja earlier, David, but that trial is essentially for Saddam Hussein. It never happens. He's charged with it. Then because he's executed for Dujail, the charges against him are essentially dropped for Halabja.
Just remind us what you're referring to there.
So for Halabja, this is the large-scale chemical attack upon the Kurdish population of the city in northern Iraq in 1988. So this is, again, in the context of the Iran-Iraq war. The Iranian offensive has taken control of the city of Halabja in the north of the country. They do so with the support of the two main Kurdish political groups in the region, the Democratic Party of Kurdistan and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. They've both aligned with the Iranians for the first time in a concerted effort to try to enable the Iranians to defeat the Iraqi government in that war. The response of the Iraqi government is to engage in a large-scale chemical bombardment of the town with mustard gas and sarin, killing upwards of 5,000 people in one attack upon that town. It's presented by the Kurdish groups, not, I think, implausibly, as a clear case of genocide, where the extermination of the population of that town was basically the objective of the Iraqi government as a way to demonstrate their revenge for the affiliation of the Kurdish groups with the Iranians during the Iran-Iraq war.
What role were the Americans playing in these decisions? So we do need to address the question of whether this was a case that was still broadly speaking under American control, or whether it had acquired a life of its own and it was now playing out through the dynamics of Iraqi politics, over which it was clear by 2004, 2005, the American regime was losing control. Did the Bush administration still have control of this process? Were they involved in these decisions? Did they, for instance, want to push the case of the Kurds and to get genocide on the table as well as this much more specific, I'm not downplaying its significance in any way, but this much more specific instance from 1982, quite a long time ago, relative to something which in international terms might play more with a wider international audience, chemical weapons, genocide, the persecution of a people, in the case of the Kurds. Were the Americans pushing for that?
I think you can't understand this process without understanding how the control over it moves from the Americans at the start, increasingly to Iraqi political parties over the course of that period of from 2003 to 2006. So at the start in 2003, it's an American authorized process in which the US hand is a very significant one. The US administration in Iraq establishes a regime crimes liaison office, which has a staff of about 100 people in late 2003, essentially of people who are working for the US government in bringing the information to bear that could be used in a trial against former members of the government. This is an American process in the sense that it's organized through the funding, through the facilities of the US government, in which the prisoners are held in US detention between their appearances in court, and in which the US say about what happens, when it happens, how it happens, is a very significant one. But over the course of the next 2 years, what you have increasingly is a decline of US interest in that process. There is a way within which, I think by 2004, with the increasingly intense insurgency, US interest has shifted. Political interest in Washington, wider US public interest, interest of the forces in Iraq themselves is no longer on the former regime. And so what you have is, I think, increasingly the Iraqi political parties being the primary vehicle through which the dynamics of making decisions about the trial would take place. And so by 2005, when the decision about how to prioritize the charges is made, at that point, I think the US role is a relatively small one in which their primary presentation is that this is an Iraqi-run process. This is for the Iraqis to make decisions. It's not about us making decisions. It's about us helping the Iraqis make their decisions. In which, although they have those tools of influence there, they certainly do it in terms of how to fight against an insurgency, which again is still presented as an Iraqi process, but they still have the interests, the capabilities, the mechanisms to ensure that the decisions that the Iraqis take fit in with US objectives. In terms of the prosecution, that's just really not the case. I think by that point, they essentially have lost interest to a very significant extent in and how this trial actually occurs. And as long as it leads to the conviction of Saddam Hussein and other leading members of the regime, they're not that concerned about for what crime that decision is taken.
How was it decided who to charge alongside Saddam, and what was the significance of that? So the interest of all parties, the United States, and now leading politicians within the new regime in Iraq, was to make this about the regime as well as about Saddam himself. But it was also to make it about Saddam himself. I think these two things were both present in the calculations of all parties. Everyone knew in the eyes of the wider world, this is the trial of Saddam Hussein. Apart from anything else, his fame, his name recognition dwarfed everyone else by a factor, a magnitude of I don't know how much. So this is always going to be known. It's known if you look it up, if you Wikipedia it or whatever, it's the trial of Saddam Hussein. But it was alongside, as I said before, a small group of people. So you could cast the net quite widely. I mean, there's always a choice in these cases of how widely do you cast the net? Do you want to paint the regime itself as complicit from top to bottom? Do you want to establish this as a regime in which a small group of people, maybe including family members and the very elite around Saddam, were primarily responsible? Do you want to paint it as a regime which was effectively a genuine dictatorship in which one man was calling all the shots? In the end, these were trials that put between 5 and 10 people in the dock in the two cases. How was that decision made? Do you think it was the right decision? So, for instance, if you want to say the way to characterize where real culpability lay in this regime is in not just the man at the top, but a very small group of individuals around him, rather than more broadly. Is that plausible?
It's a good question. And out of the 8 people tried, there is that mix of people at the national level and at the local level in the Dujail trial. There is Saddam Hussein, there is the head of intelligence, who's also his half brother, Barzan Hassan. There is the deputy prime minister, who's put on trial as well for this. And then there is the chief judge. So those are the people at the national level. So you have those being put on trial and in each of those cases executed for their role.
And we should say we are talking about 1982, so we're going back 24 years, which, if nothing else, points to the longevity of the regime, but also how long these people were in post and in power.
Yes, that's right. It does give a sort of sense of them being significant figures, not just in that point in the early 80s, but as being figures who had had a significant role throughout a large part of that government's tenure. Alongside that, though, you do have 4 locals being convicted, people who were members of the Ba'ath Party in Dujail itself, who were presented as being the primary organisers of the roundup of Dujail's citizens. And I think that that is a deliberate strategy. It's both that this is something that involves national leadership, but this is also something that involves local individuals who take a role in trying to prove to the Ba'ath Party that they are loyal by essentially assisting with the roundup of their neighbours to ensure that they're persecuted. And so you have, I mean, it's quite striking that out of the 3 who were convicted, 1 was acquitted, but out of the 3 locals who were convicted, 1 was a postman, 1 was a farmer, and 1 was a mechanic. They were significant figures in the Ba'ath Party, but they're also people with what you might see as relatively mundane roles within the community. But they were members of the party and they took that role in the party seriously. So it's a way of sort of, in some ways, demonstrating that individuals who align themselves with the party, who try to sort of demonstrate their loyalty through supporting the regime's brutality, were not somehow innocent of the actions just because they were ordered from the top.
In the second part of this conversation, we're going to talk more about the outcome of the trial, its aftermath, different ways of thinking about what took place in the courtroom, and also we're going to talk about the circumstances of Saddam's execution. But I'm interested in the fact that one of the 8 defendants was acquitted. And this is a theme that's come up a lot in this series in relation to all sorts of political trials, which are often described as show trials, and there's a choreography to it. But sometimes the choreography includes the need for people not to believe that everything about this is foreordained and that the whole thing is a stitch up. How and why was the one person who was acquitted acquitted? Do you know? What was the basis on which he was acquitted?
The basis for acquitting that person was that there was no evidence brought against them. So, so in some ways, it was unclear why they were on trial in the first place. It's essentially one sentence in the judgment that's made that no evidence was brought against this individual. Charges were dropped, and then they were subsequently acquitted.
So it was more charges dropped than an actual acquittal by assessing the evidence. There was no evidence.
There was no evidence and the charges were dropped. It's unclear why that person was even put on trial in the first place, other than the fact that they were clearly a member of the Ba'ath Party in Dujail at the time, but no further evidence was brought. And I think it is important. I think that does show something about how this was a process that did take evidence, at least in some sense, seriously, that part of what's going on is the comprehensive presentation of the records that are kept by the Iraqi government of what happens in 1982 to an audience of those who are looking on, who may be a relatively small number of people who are looking on, but they do want to see that brought out, displayed, shown to an international audience as being relevant before they're willing to say, yes, we want this to continue. So I think that demonstration of guilt, I think, does become an important part of the whole reason for continuing this process of making sure it happens, making sure it's taken through to its conclusion.
The last question I want to ask you in this part of the conversation is whether you think in this case something was lost by Saddam being charged with this very specific offence or set of offences, an event that had taken place 24 years earlier, targeting a particular community, and the event itself had been championed for a long time by a particular political party. So this event was very much wrapped up in the dynamics of Iraqi politics, Iraqi party politics, sectarian divisions. Given the range of things that he could have been charged with, in a lot of the cases that I've talked about in this series, there is an effort made with people who are accused of being terrible people running terrible regimes to identify a particular event, a particular incident. It could be an individual murder. This is true in the trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem, where there was a huge focus on trying to make sure that he could be accused of having actually murdered one individual, just one individual, a boy. And it turned out they couldn't make that case. They couldn't make it stick. Alongside that, he was also accused of being responsible for the deaths of up to 6 million people. And the two were somehow held together in the case. In the case of the Gang of Four, just talked about in this series in China, they were accused both of a very specific set of offences in their case in relation to the aftermath of Mao's death and an attempt to mount a coup against the regime, and the very broad crime of being responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands and the persecution of hundreds of thousands of people during the Cultural Revolution. In the case of Saddam, everything ended up focused on this one case. So he was not charged with, evidence was not brought for wider offences, for the broader crime of having instigated the Iran-Iraq war, for the invasion of Kuwait, for other acts which might fall under the heading of genocide. Do you think something was lost by the fact that the legal proceedings against Saddam Hussein and these others just focused on one particular event and the effects of that event on one particular community?
I think that's clearly true. I think there are many within the Kurdish community of northern Iraq especially, who were very upset that they never got their day in court. They never had the moment to challenge the basis of the Anfal campaign, which still, the vast majority of Kurds, is the key crime of the Saddam government. They never got that to be taken through to prosecution of the leader. Others were prosecuted for that after Saddam was executed, but the leadership itself, there was no evidence brought in a concerted way to show the culpability of the leadership for that campaign. One could think of many other cases of individuals who also can, I think, legitimately feel that their cause has not been represented by the Iraqi government because there was no attempt to prosecute them. What you had essentially was a quick process whereby after the verdict on Dujail was taken, the move to execute the leaders was taken, and that prevented any further attempt to try to go over the past crimes in a way that would enable those issues to lead to some form of meaningful redress. And so where Dujail has its memorial now to the crimes committed by the regime, in which the story of the trial is part of that memorial, many other cases there is no similar process through which the crimes committed in that period from all the way through from 1968 all the way through to 2003, there is no equivalent process through which those crimes are formalised and memorialised, are remembered, are spoken about, are used in books and school syllabuses. That whole process, I think, in some ways does prevent a meaningful resolution, insofar as resolution could ever be achieved, of those past crimes.
So this was not, whatever else it was, a process of truth and reconciliation?
No, it wasn't. And I think it couldn't be if the whole idea of trying to move to a relatively quick process of putting the leaders on trial and having them eliminated was still a significant part of what this was all about, which I think it was. There was no attempt to try to keep that leadership, former leadership, in a position of public prominence such that their actions could be raked over the course of many years. In many truth and reconciliation processes, including in South Africa, this is a process that lasts for many years. This is a process in which a huge amount of evidence is collected and disseminated, in which a large number of people are involved. That just isn't what's going on in Iraq in 2003 to 2006. This is about removing the former regime, discrediting them, showing that they're not coming back. And if that's the objective, then this isn't about making information known to a wider public. It's about disposing of that former leadership.
The second part of my conversation with Glen Rangwala is going to be available from tomorrow on PPF+. So if you'd like to hear it, you know what to do. Click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com, and subscribe to get all of our bonus episodes, plus ad-free listening. In tomorrow's episode, Glen and I talk about the aftermath of Saddam Hussein's trial, including the grisly circumstances surrounding Saddam's execution. But we also talk about the legacy of the trial and indeed of the Iraq War for the politics of Iraq, of the region, of the wider world. Glen has got some really interesting things to say about what the Iraq War means today. Maybe not all of them what you would expect. It's a fascinating conversation, and if you'd like to hear it, do please subscribe now to PPF+. Next time in our regular slot, I am going to be talking geopolitics with Helen Thompson, a pair of episodes in which we talk about the weirdness of American power, just how unusual, unlikely, unsettling, unpredictable it is to live in a world dominated by the United States. And seen in the very broad sweep of history, how anomalous is what's happening under Trump today. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.